At the shopping center, a young boy approaches a wealthy CEO and says, "Excuse me, sir, this photo of my mom fell out of your pocket." The man stops in his tracks, stunned by the words he just heard. The mall was buzzing with holiday spirit. Sparkling lights dangled like stars from the high ceilings, their shine mirrored in the shiny store windows. The melody of carolers singing decked the halls, filled the air, blending with the ringing of Salvation Army bells and the muffled chatter of countless conversations. Families hurried through the throngs, arms loaded with shopping bags, faces glowing from the indoor warmth and the winter cold outside. Kids chattered excitedly, pulling their parents toward toy store displays or Santa's workshop. But James Carter didn't notice any of it. He walked through the mall with determination, his polished shoes clicking sharply on the tiled floor. He was dressed too formally for the setting, wearing a tailored gray suit, a black wool coat, and a silk scarf neatly tied around his neck. His phone was pressed to his ear, his voice low and sharp as he gave quick instructions to someone on the other end. "I said I want those numbers finalized tonight. No excuses. It's Christmas Eve, not a day to miss deadlines." As he spoke, he navigated through the crowd, eyes focused ahead, dodging last-minute shoppers and kids with sticky candy cane hands. James Carter moved through the festive chaos like an outsider, untouched by the joy, his expression as hard as stone. People glanced at him as he passed, noticing the commanding presence of a man who seemed out of place. But he paid no attention. A small child bumped into his leg and fell, letting out a cry. James paused briefly, looking down with a startled expression, then offered a quick, muttered apology to the flustered mother before moving on. His mind was far from where he stood, already focused on contracts, meetings, and profit margins. James Carter was a man who didn't waste time, but time was about to waste him. "Sir, hey, sir." The small voice cut through the noise like a clear, pure bell. James barely noticed it at first, distracted by his call and the surrounding chaos. "Sir." The voice was louder this time, insistent. James felt a tug at his coat sleeve, sharp enough to grab his attention. He stopped mid-stride, frowning down at the small figure now standing before him. A boy no older than 7 or 8, with a messy mop of brown hair sticking out from under a knit beanie. The child's cheeks were rosy, either from excitement or the cold, and his blue eyes were wide as they stared up at James. "What?" James started, surprised to find himself face to face with the child. "Hey, sir, this picture of my mom fell out of your pocket." James blinked. My pocket? His first thought was to dismiss the boy. Another scam, perhaps? Or just a child mistaking him for someone else. But then he saw what the boy held in his outstretched hand. A small, crumpled photograph. The world seemed to tilt slightly. James froze, the chatter around him fading into a low buzz in the back of his mind. His gaze dropped to the photo, and even from that quick glance, he knew exactly what it was, what she looked like. No, it couldn't be. He glanced quickly at the boy and then back to the photograph, as if expecting the illusion to disappear. But it didn't. The edges were bent, and the image was slightly worn, as if it had been handled many times, folded and unfolded again. It was unmistakable, though. The soft brown hair that fell past her shoulders. The way her eyes always seemed to hold a laugh, even when her mouth didn't. Her smile, small but radiant. It was Sarah. Sarah, who he hadn't seen in over a decade. Sarah, whose absence still lingered in his life like a shadow in the corner of a room. Always there, but never spoken of. James's heart pounded in his chest, an unfamiliar ache spreading through him. He realized the boy was watching him expectantly, holding the photograph higher, as though James might have missed it the first time. "That's my mom," the boy said proudly. "It fell out of your coat. See." James's throat went dry. He looked sharply at the boy, scanning him for any sign, any resemblance, any explanation that might make sense of this impossible moment. "I'm sorry, kid. What did you say?" James's voice came out rough and uneven, a stark contrast to his usual polished tone. The boy grinned, misinterpreting James's bewilderment as confusion. "This picture, it was right behind you. It must have fallen when you walked by. You dropped it." He waved it slightly for emphasis, and James flinched as if the movement might shatter something delicate. James's gaze darted to the ground around him, as if searching for evidence that he'd unknowingly carried it. But it wasn't there. He hadn't dropped the photograph. He hadn't even thought about Sarah in months, no years, he told himself. So where had this come from? Slowly, carefully, James reached for the photograph. His hands trembled, betraying him, as his fingers brushed against the worn paper and he took it from the boy. It felt heavier than it should, as though it carried the weight of memories James had buried long ago. His eyes lingered on the image for only a moment, just long enough for the ache in his chest to deepen. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the noise around them. The boy frowned, confused by the question. "I told you, it fell out of your pocket." James shook his head faintly. "No, that's not possible. I don't." He cut himself off, staring at the photograph again, searching for something, anything, that would explain why this boy, this child, had a picture of Sarah. "She's my mom," the boy said, a note of pride softening his voice. "Isn't she pretty?" James couldn't respond. His mouth went dry. His words caught somewhere between his brain and the weight in his chest. He felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. The boy tilted his head, studying James with curiosity. "Do you know her? You look funny." James blinked, his gaze snapping back to the boy's face. A sudden, inexplicable panic flared inside him. "Do you know her?" The question echoed in his mind like a drumbeat. Did he? Or had he ever really known Sarah at all? I'm sorry," James muttered, his voice uneven. "I think there's been a mistake." He handed the photograph back toward the boy, but his hand lingered, almost reluctant to let go. The boy's smile faltered, as if he'd expected something more from this moment. Something grander, something warmer. "But I have to go." James cut him off. The words came out sharper than he intended. He turned abruptly, shoving his phone back to his ear as though it could anchor him to reality. "Wait," the boy called after him. But James didn't stop. He walked faster, his polished shoes clicking against the tiles, his hand gripping the phone even though he wasn't speaking. His heart was pounding, his chest tight. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to leave. As he disappeared into the crowd, the boy stood there, the photograph clutched in his small hands. He stared after James with a confused frown, as though trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. In the distance, the carolers sang the final line of "Deck the Halls." And somewhere, buried beneath James Carter's finely tailored coat and carefully constructed life, something cracked. James didn't stop moving. His footsteps echoed sharply in his ears, out of rhythm with the festive hum around him. The photograph, the boy, Sarah. It was a string of impossible coincidences. And yet his heart wouldn't stop hammering, as if trying to pound some long-buried truth back into his mind. His phone, still clutched tightly in his hand, was silent now. At some point, the call had dropped, but James hadn't noticed, and for once he didn't care. He swerved through crowds, avoiding eye contact with families, couples, and clusters of joyful strangers. Every smiling face seemed like a cruel contrast to the storm inside him. He stopped near an enormous Christmas tree in the mall's atrium. It soared up toward the skylight, its branches covered in shimmering lights and ornaments, a centerpiece of holiday cheer. James stood there, breathing hard, his hands shaking just enough for him to notice. "It's just a mistake," he told himself. "A strange coincidence. The boy doesn't know anything." The moment kept replaying in his mind, the little boy, so innocent, holding up that photograph like it was some kind of treasure. "That's my mom." The thought made James's stomach churn. How could this child have a photo of her, of Sarah? "Get a grip," he muttered under his breath. He tightened the scarf around his neck as if the pressure could steady him. His eyes darted through the crowd behind him, searching for the boy. There he was. The little boy stood exactly where James had left him, near the railing by Santa's workshop. He was still holding the photograph, turning it over in his small hands like it held a mystery he couldn't solve. His face was scrunched in a frown, the kind of frustrated determination kids have when something doesn't add up. James felt an unexpected pang of guilt for walking away. The boy didn't deserve that. He was just a child. But James couldn't go back. He couldn't explain something he didn't understand himself. The past was like a locked door in his mind, one he'd bolted shut years ago. It wasn't supposed to creak open. Walk away, he thought. Just walk away. And yet his legs refused to move. Before he could stop himself, James found himself retracing his steps. His heart pounded harder with every step until he stopped a few feet from the boy, who still hadn't noticed his return. James cleared his throat softly, and the child's head shot up. His face lit up immediately, as if James's return made everything right again. "Hey, you came back." James tried to soften his expression, though he doubted he succeeded. "Listen, kid," he said stiffly, gesturing toward the photograph. "I think you're mistaken. That's not mine." The boy tilted his head, frowning as he held the photo up again. "But it was on the ground, right behind you. And that's my mom. See?" He pointed to the image with one finger, so certain, so trusting. James forced himself to look. It was no easier the second time. Sarah's smile stared back at him, so familiar it hurt. It was a younger version of her, maybe 25, 26, long before life had hardened her features. She looked happy, the way James remembered her when he still thought the world could be simple, when love had felt like enough. For a fleeting second, he thought about snatching the photograph back. Is it mine? Did I lose it somehow? But no, that was impossible. He didn't carry old photographs. He didn't cling to ghosts. His voice came out strained, more forceful than he intended. "It isn't mine. You must have gotten it mixed up with someone else's." The boy stared at him for a long moment, his small brow furrowing like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Then he held the photo tighter. "No, I know it's hers." James exhaled sharply, his pulse quickening. "Kid, I'm telling you, do you know her?" the boy interrupted. His voice was small but unwavering. "You looked funny when you saw it. Like you knew her." James froze. The words pierced him, unsettling in their honesty. He swallowed hard, trying to push away the sudden ache. "I don't. I've never seen her before." It wasn't entirely a lie. He'd never seen this version of her before, the one frozen in time in the boy's photograph. The boy's shoulders slumped slightly. He glanced down at the picture, his expression unsure. "But you look sad," he said softly, almost to himself. James felt his throat tighten. This needed to end. Whatever strange, cruel trick the universe had played on him tonight, whatever coincidence brought Sarah's ghost back to him in the form of a photograph and a child, it wasn't his to unravel. "Look, I have to go," James said, stepping back, his voice steadier now, carefully neutral. "Merry Christmas, kid." The boy's eyes lifted quickly, searching James's face one last time, as if he could find an answer there. He looked disappointed, his small hands gripping the photograph tighter. "Oh, okay. Merry Christmas, sir." The words tugged at something deep in James's chest. He ignored it. With a curt nod, he turned away, forcing himself to walk without looking back. The mall swallowed him again, its lights too bright, its cheer suddenly oppressive. James shoved his hands deep into his coat pockets and strode toward the exit, his breath tight and shallow as he went. "It doesn't mean anything," he told himself. "The photo, the boy, it's just a fluke." But that wasn't true, and he knew it. As the automatic doors slid open, letting in a gust of icy air, James glanced over his shoulder one last time. He could just barely see the boy through the sea of people, still standing near the railing, the photograph held close to his chest. James turned his gaze back to the snow-dusted parking lot. It stretched before him like a blank page, cold and empty. He didn't look back again. The drive home was a blur. James sat stiffly in the back of his town car, his jaw clenched as the world rushed past the window. He kept trying to tell himself it didn't matter, that Sarah was just a part of his past, as unreachable as a dream he'd woken up from long ago. But the photograph wouldn't leave his mind. Her face, that smile, the boy. He raked a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling under his skin. "It's impossible," he muttered, staring out at the snowflakes falling against the dark sky. The car slowed to a stop in front of his penthouse building. James stepped out without a word, ignoring the doorman's cheerful greeting as he walked inside. In the quiet of the elevator, James let his head fall back against the wall, closing his eyes. He could still see the photograph as clearly as if it were right in front of him. Sarah's face, her eyes, and the boy's voice echoing in his head. "That's my mom. Do you know her?" James opened his eyes, staring at his own reflection in the polished doors. He didn't have an answer. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, spilling James into the muted luxury of his penthouse. The space was pristine, devoid of warmth, an expanse of marble floors, sleek furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows framing the glittering city skyline. The silence inside was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the heating system and James's footsteps as he walked to his study. He dropped his keys onto the polished desk with a dull clink and sank into the leather chair, elbows braced on his knees, face buried in his hands. He stayed like that for a while, breathing hard, as though the act of moving through his day had drained every ounce of his strength. The photograph, the boy's words, played on a loop in his mind. "That's my mom. Do you know her?" James sat up abruptly and rubbed his face with both hands. He couldn't let this unravel him. It was ridiculous. He didn't believe in fate or chance, or ghosts of the past returning at Christmas time. He believed in logic, control, the things he could measure and manipulate. And yet, he opened his laptop and tried to focus on work, bringing up a spreadsheet he'd intended to finish that evening. His inbox pinged with an endless stream of emails, reminders of meetings, numbers that needed reviewing, a client presentation that his team was waiting for. James forced himself to focus, but the letters and numbers blurred together on the screen. Sarah, her name surfaced in his thoughts unbidden, like the echo of a melody he hadn't heard in years. James groaned and pushed away from the desk, standing abruptly. His office felt too small, too stifling. He crossed to the window and stared out at the city below, twinkling lights stretching as far as the horizon, countless lives weaving through the night. Somewhere out there, Sarah might still exist. Could it be? He turned away from the view and went back to his desk. With a deep breath, James reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out his wallet. He hesitated for only a moment before opening it and slipping out a small, worn photograph. The edges were frayed, the image slightly faded, but it was unmistakable. It was the same photograph the little boy had held up that evening, the same face that had haunted him for years. Sarah. James sank back into his chair, the photograph resting on his palm. He stared at it for a long time, his expression unreadable. She looked so young, her face radiant with hope, with joy. This had been taken during their college years, just before everything fell apart. His fingers traced the edge of the photo, and the memories came flooding back, washing over him like a wave. They met during their first year at college. James had been ambitious even then, sharp-tongued, determined, with a natural charm that drew people to him. Sarah, on the other hand, was his opposite. Soft-spoken but fiercely intelligent, with a kindness that made the world around her seem gentler. James could still remember the first time he saw her. She'd been sitting on the campus lawn beneath a sprawling oak tree, a book in her lap, sunlight filtering through the branches to play across her face. She'd smiled when he approached, an unguarded, genuine smile that disarmed him completely. He'd spent the rest of that afternoon beside her, pretending to read while stealing glances at her from the corner of his eye. Their friendship turned into something deeper before long. They spent nights studying together in the library, whispering between the shelves when the librarian glared at them. He'd walk her home through the quiet streets of their small college town, hands stuffed into his pockets, pretending not to notice when their fingers brushed together. Sarah had dreams. Dreams of teaching, of traveling, of building a life that wasn't defined by money or success. James's dreams, though, were bigger. He wanted to build empires. He wanted to leave a legacy that people would talk about long after he was gone. "You're going to change the world someday," Sarah had told him one night as they sat beneath the same oak tree, her head resting against his shoulder. James had laughed softly. "Only if you're in it with me." She looked up at him then, her eyes so full of love that it made his chest ache. "Always," she whispered. But always wasn't as long as James thought it would be. As graduation approached, James became consumed by ambition. He spent his days chasing opportunities, networking with people he thought could help him climb higher. Sarah tried to keep up at first, but he could see the way it wore on her. The late nights he didn't come home, the phone calls that went unanswered, the quiet dinners where neither of them said much at all. "You're losing yourself, James," she'd said to him one night, her voice breaking as she stood by the door with her coat in her hand. "And you're losing me." James had said nothing. He couldn't. Part of him thought she would come back, that she would understand eventually why he had to work so hard, why it all mattered. But she didn't. When she walked out that door, James let her go. He told himself it was for the best. Love was a distraction, and he didn't have time for distractions. Years passed, and James achieved everything he thought he wanted. Success, wealth, power. But he never stopped carrying that photograph. It stayed in his wallet, tucked behind credit cards and crisp bills, a secret reminder of the life he'd left behind. James blinked back to the present, his gaze fixed on Sarah's face. For years, he'd convinced himself that she was a part of his past, a chapter he'd closed long ago. But now, that little boy, Tommy, had torn those pages wide open. The boy's voice echoed in James's mind. "Asterisk, that's my mom. Do you know her? Asterisk, could it be? Was it possible that Sarah was still out there? That she had a son?" James's chest tightened at the thought. A son. His thoughts raced faster, grasping at fragments of logic that refused to form a whole. If Tommy was Sarah's son, what did that mean? How could it be? And then another question surfaced, unspoken but deafening. Could he be mine? James's breath caught at the thought, his grip tightening on the photograph. It didn't make sense. He hadn't seen Sarah in over a decade. But the boy, his age, his wide blue eyes, that small but insistent voice. There was something about him that James couldn't shake. The office felt colder now, the silence heavier. James ran a hand through his hair, letting out a shuddering breath as he stared at the photograph in his hand. "What did you do with your life, Sarah?" he whispered. It was a question for her, but it was also for himself. James sat there for hours, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the windows, the photograph still resting in his palm. He couldn't ignore it now. He couldn't pretend it didn't matter. Sarah was out there somewhere, and maybe, just maybe, so was a child who shared his blood. And for the first time in years, James Carter, the man who always had a plan, always had the answers, felt utterly lost. The mall had grown quieter as the evening wound down. The crowds thinned. The carolers packed up their songbooks, and stores began to dim their lights in preparation for closing. At the edge of the bustling food court, Sarah sat across from Tommy at a small, slightly wobbly table. She watched him finish the last of his hot chocolate, his nose dusted with whipped cream and his face flushed from excitement and the lingering chill. "So, tell me again what happened," she asked, a teasing smile tugging at her lips. Tommy looked up, his blue eyes wide with importance. "I told you, Mom. I saw him drop this picture, and when I gave it back, He looked really funny. Like, Tommy's little brows scrunched together as he searched for the right words. Like he saw a ghost or something. Sarah chuckled softly, shaking her head as she took a sip of her coffee. A ghost? Huh? Well, not really a ghost, Tommy corrected quickly. He pulled the now slightly crinkled photograph from his jacket pocket and held it up between his fingers. But when he saw this, he got all quiet and weird. I think he knows you, Mom. Sarah paused mid-sip, her smile faltering just slightly as she glanced at the photograph. She hadn't seen it in years. It was an old picture, one taken during her college days when her whole world felt brighter and simpler. James had taken that photo of her one summer afternoon. She remembered, catching her off guard as she sat under an oak tree, laughing at something he'd said. At the time, she protested, saying she wasn't ready and her hair looked awful. But when she saw it later, she couldn't help but smile. He had always had a way of capturing her, seeing her in a way no one else did. The memory tugged at her heart, just for a moment, before she tucked it away again. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "I think you must have been mistaken. Maybe it wasn't his picture at all." Tommy shook his head, adamant. "No way. He looked like he'd seen you before. He didn't say it, but I could tell." Sarah laughed softly, a light sound that carried a hint of disbelief. "People can look like other people, you know. It happens all the time." Tommy pouted, his little hands still gripping the photograph tightly. But why would he look so sad then? He looked really sad, Mom, like he needed a hug or something. Sarah reached out and smoothed his hair, her smile softening. Maybe he was just having a hard day. The holidays can be rough for some people, even if they don't show it. Tommy looked thoughtful for a moment, his small shoulders lifting in a shrug. "I think he needs a Christmas friend." Sarah blinked, caught off guard by the innocence and purity of his words. "A Christmas friend?" "Yeah." Tommy nodded earnestly. "You always say Christmas is for helping people feel loved and not alone. Well, that man looked really, really alone. I hope he comes back, and if he does, I'm going to tell him he can be my Christmas friend." Sarah felt something tighten in her chest, a warmth mingled with an old ache. Her son had always been like this, pure of heart, quick to care for others. It was one of the things she cherished most about him, even as it sometimes broke her heart. She reached across the table and gently took his small hand in hers. "You have such a big heart, Tommy," she said softly. "But I don't think he'll be coming back. Whoever he was, he probably didn't even remember the picture." Tommy's lips pursed, thoughtful again. "I still think he knew you." Sarah smiled faintly, though her eyes looked distant now. "Well, sweetheart, if he did, I'm sure it's just someone from a long time ago. People move on. That's just how life works." Tommy stared at her, his young face furrowed with confusion. "But you didn't forget about Dad." The words hung in the air for a moment, soft but heavy. Sarah's smile faltered, and she gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "No, I didn't," she said quietly. "But that's different. Some people are always a part of us, even if they're not here anymore." Tommy nodded as though he understood, even if he didn't fully. He stared down at the photograph again, his small fingers tracing its edges. "I just think that man was really sad. Maybe we could have made him happy." Sarah studied him for a long moment, her heart swelling with both pride and something deeper, something harder to name. She reached out and brushed her thumb across his cheek, smoothing away a smudge of whipped cream. "You're a good kid, Tommy," she said softly. "You know that." Tommy beamed, the photograph forgotten for the moment, as he polished off the rest of his hot chocolate. Sarah sat back in her chair, watching him with a thoughtful expression. For all her efforts to laugh off the encounter, the image of the man Tommy described lingered in her mind. A man who looked like he'd seen a ghost. It couldn't be. She shook her head slightly, dismissing the thought. It was impossible. She hadn't seen James Carter in years, hadn't heard from him, hadn't looked for him. Whatever part of her life he occupied had been buried long ago, left in the dust of ambition and broken promises. And yet, as she watched Tommy swing his feet under the table, the thought lingered, unwelcome but persistent. What if? Sarah glanced at the clock hanging above the food court and sighed, forcing herself back to the present. "Come on, kiddo," she said, standing and tugging her coat around her shoulders. "It's getting late. We should get home." Tommy slid out of his chair and stuffed the photograph back into his jacket pocket, keeping it safe as though it were a treasure. Sarah shook her head affectionately, her smile returning as she took his hand. Together, they made their way toward the mall exit, the sounds of holiday cheer still echoing around them. Outside, the night was calm, the snowfall gentle as it dusted the cars and sidewalks in a layer of soft white. The world seemed quieter here, muffled by the snow and the lateness of the hour. Tommy skipped ahead a few steps, his boots crunching through the fresh snow as he hummed a Christmas song under his breath. Sarah watched him fondly, her heart swelling with gratitude despite the ache of exhaustion that came with working long hours and making ends meet. Christmas had always been her favorite time of year, but it had grown harder since Tommy's father passed. She did her best, though. She always did her best. And as she looked up at the dark sky, the snowflakes drifting lazily down, she allowed herself one fleeting moment to wonder where James Carter was tonight, and if, perhaps, he was still as lost as he'd been all those years ago. Tommy's voice broke the silence as he turned back toward her, his grin wide. "Mom, do you think Santa's gonna bring you something special this year?" Sarah smiled, pulling her coat tighter against the cold as she reached for his hand. "I think I already have everything I need." But Tommy just smiled knowingly, his small fingers gripping hers. "I bet he's gonna bring you a Christmas friend, too." Sarah laughed softly, shaking her head as they walked toward home, their footprints trailing behind them in the snow. James barely slept that night. The city skyline, aglow with lights, stretched endlessly beyond the penthouse windows, but James didn't see it. He sat at his desk, the photograph of Sarah still in his hand, turning it over again and again like it might yield answers if he stared hard enough. The boy's voice wouldn't leave him. "That's my mom." By the time the first hint of dawn broke over the horizon, James was pacing. He tried to push it all away, to tell himself it was none of his business. But the image of Sarah's face and the little boy who carried it was burned into his mind. It was absurd, of course, this nagging feeling that he couldn't shake. And yet, as he stood there watching the snow drift lazily across the city below, James knew there was no escaping it. He had to go back. The mall was alive with Christmas cheer again the next day, the kind of joy James always found exhausting this time of year. Music piped through unseen speakers, the scent of cinnamon and fresh-baked pretzels hung in the air, and families bustled through the decorated halls. James felt out of place, like a smudge of gray paint on a festive canvas. He adjusted his coat and pushed forward, scanning the crowds. It was foolish, really. The boy could be anywhere or nowhere. He might not even come back. And yet James couldn't silence the quiet hope bubbling inside him. If I find the boy, maybe I can make sense of this. He worked his way through the mall's sprawling levels, passing busy storefronts, dodging children with oversized stuffed animals, and ignoring the curious glances of passing shoppers. By the time he reached the center atrium, he was beginning to think he'd been wrong to come. And then he saw him. Tommy. The boy sat on a bench near Santa's workshop, swinging his legs as he watched the line of children waiting to meet Santa Claus. The oversized red and white display, complete with a towering tree and animatronic reindeer, seemed to cast a glow over the space, making it look almost magical. Tommy, however, didn't seem caught up in the excitement. He was staring at something in his hands, frowning thoughtfully. The photograph. James's chest tightened. He hesitated, his feet refusing to move. What was he doing? What did he hope to accomplish here? But then Tommy looked up, and James realized he'd already been seen. Tommy's face brightened instantly. "Hey, you came back." James froze for half a second, then approached slowly, hands buried deep in his coat pockets. His voice felt awkward in his throat. "Hi there." Tommy scooted to the side on the bench, making room without being asked. "Are you looking for me?" James sat, surprised at how easily Tommy assumed his intentions. "Maybe," he admitted quietly. He glanced at the photograph, still crumpled slightly in Tommy's small hand. "You still have it?" "Of course," Tommy said earnestly. "It's my favorite picture of Mom." James swallowed, his gaze softening as he looked at the boy. Up close, there was something about him, something familiar. The boy's blue eyes shone with innocence, but they held a quiet strength too, the kind that came from facing life's little hardships head-on. "I wanted to apologize," James said, shifting uncomfortably. "For yesterday. I wasn't very kind to you." Tommy shrugged like it didn't matter, though James noticed the way he clutched the photograph just a little tighter. "It's okay. Grown-ups get grumpy sometimes." James almost smiled at that. "Is that what you think happened?" Tommy nodded confidently. "Yeah, you looked really sad, so I figured maybe you just needed some time to feel better." James blinked, caught off guard by the boy's simple, unassuming kindness. He studied Tommy for a moment, watching as the boy glanced back towards Santa's workshop with a faraway look in his eyes. "Waiting to see Santa?" James asked, gesturing toward the crowd of excited children. Tommy shook his head. "No, I already saw him yesterday. I told him my wish for this year." "What did you ask for?" James asked, curiosity tugging at him. Tommy looked up, his face lighting with a smile that tugged at James's heart in ways he didn't expect. "I asked him to make Mom happy for Christmas." James felt the words hit him like a weight. "You did?" "Yep," Tommy said, swinging his legs again, his shoes lightly bumping the bench. "Mom works really hard, and sometimes she gets tired. She says we're lucky, though. She says some people don't have much at all, so we should always be grateful. But," he trailed off, his little voice quieter now, "I just think she deserves to be happy. That's what I told Santa." James's throat tightened as he listened. He turned his gaze to the bustling crowd in front of them, unable to look at Tommy's earnest face. "Your mom sounds like a good person," he said softly. "The best," Tommy replied without hesitation. He grinned, clutching the photograph proudly. "She's really nice, and she helps everybody. Even when she's tired, she makes time for me. She says I'm her Christmas miracle." James felt a pang deep in his chest, a hollow ache. "Sarah." He forced himself to ask the question he'd been avoiding, his voice quieter now. "What's your mom's name?" "Sarah," Tommy said, looking up at James with a smile. "Do you know her?" The words hit like a punch to the gut. James's heart stuttered in his chest, and for a moment he couldn't find his voice. He turned toward Tommy, carefully masking the turmoil bubbling beneath the surface. James hesitated, searching for the right words. "I knew someone named Sarah a long time ago." Tommy's eyes lit up with curiosity. "Really? Maybe it's the same person. That'd be cool." James managed a small, strange smile. "Maybe." Tommy didn't seem to notice his discomfort. He looked back toward Santa's workshop, his voice growing soft again. "I hope she gets her wish too." "What wish?" James asked, unable to stop himself. Tommy shrugged. "Mom doesn't say it out loud, but I think she wishes for someone to be her Christmas friend. You know, someone who makes her smile. She's always doing stuff for me, but I don't think she has anybody to do stuff for her." James felt something shift inside him, like ice cracking after a long freeze. The boy's words, so innocent, so heartfelt, were like a mirror, reflecting back all the things James hadn't wanted to see. Tommy hopped off the bench suddenly, turned to face James with a bright smile. "You seem nice when you're not grumpy. Maybe you could be her Christmas friend." James stared at the boy, stunned. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Tommy, oblivious to James's inner turmoil, grinned again and grabbed the photograph, holding it up triumphantly. "She'd like you, I think." And you'd like her. Everybody does. James forced a small, shaky breath and managed to smile, though his thoughts were racing. You think so? Yep, Tommy said confidently. James looked at the photograph one last time, the image of Sarah smiling back at him, and felt his chest tighten. Maybe you're right, he whispered. And for the first time in years, James Carter wasn't entirely sure what he would do next. James wasn't sure how it happened. One moment, he was sitting on the bench near Santa's workshop, completely thrown by everything Tommy had said. The next, Tommy's small hand was wrapped tightly around his fingers, tugging him along with surprising determination. Come on, you gotta meet her, Tommy said, his voice bubbling with excitement. Wait, what? James stumbled over his own feet, his mind snapping back to the present. Hold on, kid. I don't think. You'll like her, I promise, Tommy interrupted, turning back to flash James a grin. And I know she'll like you. She always says Christmas is full of surprises. James couldn't bring himself to argue. The boy's optimism was a force of nature, and before he knew it, they were weaving through the crowded mall, past clusters of families and shoppers with their arms weighed down by bags. James's heart thudded in his chest with a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. What are you doing, James? But he couldn't stop. Not now. They emerged into the food court, a sprawling space packed with people sitting at metal tables and shuffling through lines for coffee, sandwiches, and pretzels. The hum of conversation filled the air. But to James, it all seemed distant, like a muffled background noise he could barely hear. Then Tommy stopped. There she is. James froze. His breath caught as his gaze followed Tommy's outstretched hand. Sarah sat at a small table near the far end of the food court, a disposable coffee cup in her hands, her coat draped over the back of her chair. She was turned slightly away, gazing off toward the holiday decorations that adorned the mall center atrium, unaware of their approach. James's feet felt like lead. It was her, Sarah. Years had passed since he'd last seen her, but time had only refined the features he'd carried in his memory. Her hair, still the same warm brown, was swept into a loose bun, a few soft strands framing her face. There were faint lines at the corners of her eyes now, lines he didn't remember, etched there by smiles and worries he hadn't been part of. But she was still Sarah, still her. For a moment he couldn't breathe. Tommy turned back, tugging on James's hand to pull him forward. Come on, Mom! James stumbled another step, but his legs wouldn't carry him any further. He watched helplessly as Tommy ran toward her, his little voice carrying through the crowd. Mom! Mom! I found him! He's here! Sarah turned at the sound of his voice, her brow furrowed in confusion. Found who? She started to ask, but the words trailed off as her gaze lifted past Tommy and landed on James. The world seemed to freeze. Her face went pale, the color draining as if she'd seen a ghost. Her hands, still clutching her coffee cup, lowered slowly to the table. James couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He just stood there, his heart pounding in his ears, as Sarah stared at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The food court seemed to blur and quiet around them, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. Finally, Sarah found her voice, though it trembled slightly when she spoke. What are you doing here, James? The words hit him like a punch. There was no warmth in her voice, just shock, guarded by a wall of old hurt he could almost see. James forced himself to take a step closer, his throat dry. Sarah, she flinched slightly at hearing her name from his lips, her expression tightening. I asked you a question. What are you doing here? James faltered, the words escaping him. He glanced briefly at Tommy, who watched the exchange with innocent curiosity, then back at Sarah. He knew there was no simple way to explain. I didn't expect to find you here, he said finally, his voice uneven. I saw Tommy yesterday and... Sarah's eyes flickered to her son, who now stood beside her, looking between them with confusion. Tommy beamed proudly. Yeah, Mom. I told you about him. He's the man with the picture of you. James winced at the simplicity of Tommy's words. But Sarah's expression darkened, her eyes narrowing as realization set in. You have a picture of me? She asked quietly, her voice carrying a sharp edge now. James hesitated. It's complicated. Is it? Sarah shot back, her voice still low but simmering with emotion. Because it doesn't feel complicated. It feels like something I don't understand. James opened his mouth to respond, but Tommy piped up before he could. Mom, don't be mad. He's really nice. He even came back today to meet you. Sarah looked down at her son, her face softening just slightly before she turned back to James, the tension still evident in her posture. What do you want, James? James's heart twisted at her words, at the way she looked at him, like he was a stranger who didn't belong here. I don't know, he admitted, his voice rough. I didn't come looking for you. I didn't even know you were here. But I saw Tommy yesterday and... He paused, glancing at the boy. He told me about you, about his mom. Sarah straightened, her chin lifting slightly. And what? You thought you'd come and play the hero? Her words stung, but James didn't pull away. No, he said quietly. I needed to know. To know what? Sarah pressed, her voice thick with unspoken emotion. James hesitated, his gaze flicking to Tommy and back. Is he? Sarah froze, the question hanging heavy in the air between them. For a long moment, she just stared at James, her eyes searching his face as though trying to decide what to say. Finally, she shook her head. No, she said softly. Tommy isn't yours. The words felt like a blow James hadn't prepared for. And yet at the same time, they brought a strange, inexplicable relief. Sarah's voice softened, her gaze falling to her son. His father died before he was born. Tommy never got to meet him. James looked at the boy, his chest aching at the innocence in his small face. I'm sorry, he murmured. Though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for, his question, his presence, or the past itself. Sarah exhaled, her shoulders sagging slightly as the anger seemed to drain away, replaced by something more fragile. Why are you really here, James? James swallowed, his voice quieter now. Because I didn't expect to see you again. Because I saw him holding that photograph and I thought. He trailed off, shaking his head. I don't know what I thought. Sarah studied him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Finally, she turned to Tommy, her voice gentle. Sweetheart, can you give us a minute? Tommy hesitated, looking between them, but Sarah smiled. Go look at Santa's reindeer. I'll be right here. Okay, Tommy said, though he looked reluctant to leave. James's heart stuttered in his chest, and for a moment he couldn't find his voice. He turned toward Tommy, carefully masking the turmoil bubbling beneath the surface. James hesitated, searching for the right words. I knew someone named Sarah a long time ago. Tommy's eyes lit up with curiosity. Really? Maybe it's the same person. That'd be cool. James managed a small, strange smile. Maybe. Tommy didn't seem to notice his discomfort. He looked back toward Santa's workshop, his voice growing soft again. I hope she gets her wish too. What wish? James asked, unable to stop himself. Tommy shrugged. Mom doesn't say it out loud, but I think she wishes for someone to be her Christmas friend. You know, someone who makes her smile. She's always doing stuff for me, but I don't think she has anybody to do stuff for her. James felt something shift inside him, like ice cracking after a long freeze. The boy's words, so innocent, so heartfelt, were like a mirror, reflecting back all the things James hadn't wanted to see. Tommy hopped off the bench suddenly, turning to face James with a bright smile. You seem nice when you're not grumpy. Maybe you could be her Christmas friend. James stared at the boy, stunned. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Tommy, oblivious to James's inner turmoil, grinned again and grabbed the photograph, holding it up triumphantly. She'd like you, I think. And you'd like her. Everybody does. James forced a small, shaky breath and managed to smile, though his thoughts were racing. You think so? Yep, Tommy said confidently. James looked at the photograph one last time, the image of Sarah smiling back at him, and felt his chest tighten. Maybe you're right, he whispered. And for the first time in years, James Carter wasn't entirely sure what he would do next. James wasn't sure how it happened. One moment, he was sitting on the bench near Santa's workshop, completely thrown by everything Tommy had said. The next, Tommy's small hand was wrapped tightly around his fingers, tugging him along with surprising determination. Come on, you gotta meet her, Tommy said, his voice bubbling with excitement. Wait, what? James stumbled over his own feet, his mind snapping back to the present. Hold on, kid. I don't think. You'll like her, I promise, Tommy interrupted, turning back to flash James a grin. And I know she'll like you. She always says Christmas is full of surprises. James couldn't bring himself to argue. The boy's optimism was a force of nature, and before he knew it, they were weaving through the crowded mall, past clusters of families and shoppers with their arms weighed down by bags. James's heart thudded in his chest with a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. What are you doing, James? But he couldn't stop. Not now. They emerged into the food court, a sprawling space packed with people sitting at metal tables and shuffling through lines for coffee, sandwiches, and pretzels. The hum of conversation filled the air, but to James it all seemed distant, like a muffled background noise he could barely hear. Then Tommy stopped. There she is. James froze. His breath caught as his gaze followed Tommy's outstretched hand. Sarah sat at a small table near the far end of the food court, a disposable coffee cup in her hands, her coat draped over the back of her chair. She was turned slightly away, gazing off toward the holiday decorations that adorned the mall center atrium, unaware of their approach. James's feet felt like lead. It was her, Sarah. Years had passed since he'd last seen her, but time had only refined the features he'd carried in his memory. Her hair, still the same warm brown, was swept into a loose bun, a few soft strands framing her face. There were faint lines at the corners of her eyes now, lines he didn't remember, etched there by smiles and worries he hadn't been part of. But she was still Sarah. Still her. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Tommy turned back, tugging on James's hand to pull him forward. Come on, Mom! James stumbled another step, but his legs wouldn't carry him any further. He watched helplessly as Tommy ran toward her, his little voice carrying through the crowd. Mom! Mom! I found him. He's here. Sarah turned at the sound of his voice, her brow furrowed in confusion. Found who? She started to ask, but the words trailed off as her gaze lifted past Tommy and landed on James. The world seemed to freeze. Her face went pale, the color draining as if she'd seen a ghost. Her hands, still clutching her coffee cup, lowered slowly to the table. James couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He just stood there, his heart pounding in his ears, as Sarah stared at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The food court seemed to blur and quiet around them, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. Finally, Sarah found her voice, though it trembled slightly when she spoke. What are you doing here, James? The words hit him like a punch. There was no warmth in her voice, just shock, guarded by a wall of old hurt he could almost see. James forced himself to take a step closer, his throat dry. Sarah, she flinched slightly at hearing her name from his lips, her expression tightening. I asked you a question. What are you doing here? James faltered, the words escaping him. He glanced briefly at Tommy, who watched the exchange with innocent curiosity, then back at Sarah. He knew there was no simple way to explain. I didn't expect to find you here, he said finally, his voice uneven. I saw Tommy yesterday and... Sarah's eyes flickered to her son, who now stood beside her, looking between them with confusion. Tommy beamed proudly. Yeah, Mom. I told you about him. He's the man with the picture of you. James winced at the simplicity of Tommy's words. But Sarah's expression darkened, her eyes narrowing as realization set in. You have a picture of me? She asked quietly, her voice carrying a sharp edge now. James hesitated. It's complicated. Is it? Sarah shot back, her voice still low but simmering with emotion. Because it doesn't feel complicated. It feels like something I don't understand. James opened his mouth to respond, but Tommy piped up before he could. Mom, don't be mad. He's really nice. He even came back today to meet you. Sarah looked down at her son, her face softening just slightly before she turned back to James, the tension still evident in her posture. What do you want, James? James's heart twisted at her words, at the way she looked at him, like he was a stranger who didn't belong here. I don't know, he admitted, his voice rough. I didn't come looking for you. I didn't even know you were here. But I saw Tommy yesterday and... He paused, glancing at the boy. He told me about you, about his mom. Sarah straightened, her chin lifting slightly. And what? You thought you'd come and play the hero? Her words stung, but James didn't pull away. No, he said quietly. I needed to know. To know what? Sarah pressed, her voice thick with unspoken emotion. James hesitated, his gaze flicking to Tommy and back. Is he? Sarah froze, the question hanging heavy in the air between them. For a long moment, she just stared at James, her eyes searching his face as though trying to decide what to say. Finally, she shook her head. No, she said softly. Tommy isn't yours. The words felt like a blow James hadn't prepared for, and yet at the same time, they brought a strange, inexplicable relief. Sarah's voice softened, her gaze falling to her son. His father died before he was born. Tommy never got to meet him. James looked at the boy, his chest aching at the innocence in his small face. I'm sorry, he murmured, though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for, his question, his presence, or the past itself. Sarah exhaled, her shoulders sagging slightly as the anger seemed to drain away, replaced by something more fragile. Why are you really here, James? James swallowed, his voice quieter now. Because I didn't expect to see you again. Because I saw him holding that photograph, and I thought. He trailed off, shaking his head. I don't know what I thought. Sarah studied him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Finally, she turned to Tommy, her voice gentle. Sweetheart, can you give us a minute? Tommy hesitated, looking between them, but Sarah smiled. Go look at Santa's reindeer. I'll be right here. Okay, Tommy said, though he looked reluctant to leave. He gave James a small, hopeful grin before running off toward the display. James watched him go, his chest tight. When he turned back to Sarah, her gaze was still on him, softer now but guarded. I don't know why you came back, she said quietly. But Tommy isn't your responsibility. He's mine. I've spent years building a life for him, a good life. I don't need you showing up and turning it upside down. James nodded slowly, her words sinking in. I understand. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then James's voice broke the silence, low and sincere. He's a good kid, Sarah. You've done an incredible job. Sarah looked away, blinking back emotion. I've done my best. James hesitated, his voice softer now. And you? Are you happy? Sarah looked back at him, her expression bittersweet. I don't have time to think about that. James opened his mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was watch as Sarah turned toward where Tommy stood, her son's laughter ringing through the air. And in that moment, James realized just how much he'd missed and how much he'd lost. James stood near the food court table, his hands deep in his coat pockets as Sarah turned back toward him, her expression unreadable. For the first time in years, he felt out of control, uncertain, exposed, like a man standing on thin ice. Sarah's words still lingered in the air. I don't need you showing up and turning it upside down. But James couldn't shake the look in Tommy's eyes, his kindness, his hope, and the way Sarah had tried so hard to hide her own weariness. He'd seen her strength, her pride, but beneath it, there was something else, something quieter. Sarah, James began softly, hesitating. I know I have no right to ask this. Not after all these years. She lifted an eyebrow, guarded. Ask what? He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to meet her gaze. I want to invite you and Tommy to my home tomorrow, just for Christmas Eve dinner. Sarah stared at him like he'd lost his mind. James, before you say no, James interrupted, his voice earnest. It's just a small dinner. No strings. I know I don't deserve it. But Tommy, he hesitated. He has this way of reminding people what matters. And I thought, he faltered, shaking his head slightly. I just thought you both deserved something special this Christmas. Sarah looked skeptical, her arms crossing instinctively. James, we don't need anything from you. I know you don't, James said quickly, his tone softer now. But this isn't about me trying to fix things or trying to interfere. It's just a dinner. A chance for Tommy to enjoy something magical. That's all. Sarah glanced toward Tommy, who stood by Santa's sleigh display, pointing excitedly at the animatronic reindeer. The sight of her son so bright, so full of joy, made her pause. She knew how much Christmas meant to him, and she also knew how hard she'd worked to make their life steady, even when it wasn't always easy. It's just dinner, James repeated, his voice quiet. I promise. Sarah hesitated, studying his face as though searching for the truth behind his words. She didn't see the cold, ruthless man she remembered, the one who had walked away from her all those years ago. Instead, there was something different in his eyes now. Regret, humility, maybe even a glimmer of hope. Before she could answer, Tommy came running up, his cheeks flushed with excitement. Mom, did you see the reindeer? They're huge. He stopped in front of her, his grin wide, before turning his attention to James. Are you talking about us coming over for Christmas? Sarah blinked. Tommy, how did you? Tommy didn't let her finish. You're inviting us, right? He turned to James, his voice bubbling with enthusiasm. That sounds so cool. James smiled faintly. It's just a little dinner. Nothing fancy. Can we go, Mom? Please. Tommy turned his hopeful eyes on Sarah, tugging at her arm. We never get to go anywhere special for Christmas. Please. Sarah sighed, her resolve cracking. She looked back at James, who watched her quietly, not pressing but clearly waiting. She turned back to Tommy, his wide, pleading eyes making her decision for her. Fine, she said, finally relenting. But just for dinner. Tommy hooped with excitement, nearly bouncing on the spot. Yes, it's going to be the best Christmas ever. Sarah shot James a look, as though to say, you owe me for this. He only nodded, his face softening with gratitude. Tomorrow then, he said. 6 o'clock. The next evening, Sarah parked her modest car at the bottom of James's long, winding driveway. Tommy stared out the window, his eyes wide as he took in the sprawling estate that stretched out before them. Snow blanketed the grounds like a perfect quilt, glittering under the soft glow of carefully placed lights. The house itself, no, the mansion, rose like something out of a storybook, its tall windows glowing warmly against the winter night. Mom, are we going to a castle? Tommy whispered, his voice full of awe. Sarah couldn't hide her own amazement as she gripped the steering wheel, her breath fogging the windshield slightly. No, sweetheart, it's just very big. The doors opened as they approached, and a kind-faced housekeeper greeted them, helping Tommy out of his coat as Sarah awkwardly stepped into the grand foyer. She hadn't been prepared for this. James's world, James's wealth. It was overwhelming. But then Tommy gasped, and Sarah turned to see why. The entire house had been transformed into a winter wonderland. A massive Christmas tree stood in the center of the foyer, its branches dripping with twinkling lights, sparkling glass ornaments and golden ribbons. Bows of evergreen lined the grand staircase, intertwined with red bows and fairy lights. The air smelled faintly of pine, cinnamon, and freshly baked cookies. Tommy turned to James, who appeared at the top of the stairs with his hands in his pockets, watching them with an almost shy expression. "Did you do all this?" James's lips quirked into a small smile. "It's Christmas, isn't it?" Tommy laughed and ran ahead, his small boots squeaking on the polished floors as the housekeeper offered to show him the decorations in the next room. Sarah shrugged off her coat, suddenly feeling exposed in her simple dress. James stepped toward her, his voice soft. "Thank you for coming." "I didn't do this for you," Sarah replied, though her tone lacked the edge she'd intended. James nodded, as though he understood. "For Tommy, then?" "Yes," she said quietly. The evening unfolded like a dream Tommy would remember for the rest of his life. James had pulled out all the stops. A sled ride had been prepared in the snowy back garden, complete with a team of horses and warm blankets. Tommy's face lit up with pure joy as he and Sarah rode through the snow, the bells on the horses jingling with every step. Inside, a warm fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace as Christmas carols played softly in the background. A simple but elegant dinner was served at a long table adorned with candles and pine garlands. Tommy chattered nonstop, his laughter filling the spaces where the silence might have been awkward. Sarah watched him with quiet pride, but every so often, her gaze drifted to James, who seemed softer tonight, warmer. Over dessert, James turned to Sarah. "Can we talk?" She looked hesitant, but after a moment, she nodded. Tommy had fallen asleep on the couch by the fire, his cheeks pink with the glow of the flames. James led Sarah to a smaller sitting room, where they sat across from each other. For a moment, neither spoke. "I'm sorry," James said finally, his voice quiet but clear. "For everything." Sarah stared at him, her arms crossed. "Why now, James?" James looked down at his hands, then back at her. "Because I've spent years chasing things that don't matter. And when I met Tommy, when I saw that photograph, it reminded me of what I lost, what I threw away." Sarah's expression softened, though she said nothing. James hesitated before adding, "You've done an incredible job with him, Sarah. He's kind and thoughtful. He's everything I'm not." "You're wrong," she said softly. "You're here now." James looked at her, startled. Sarah sighed, her gaze drifting toward the firelight spilling in from the next room. "People change, James." James smiled back, the warmth of her words like the first rays of sunlight breaking through a long, dark winter. Christmas morning arrived with a quiet hush, the kind of stillness only snow could bring. Pale light streamed through the windows of James's sprawling estate, casting soft shadows across the rooms adorned in festive cheer. The air was filled with the faint scent of pine, cinnamon, and the warmth of crackling logs from the fireplace. Sarah sat curled up in an armchair, a blanket draped over her legs, her eyes fluttering closed as she listened to the gentle rhythm of the fire. Tommy lay sprawled on the rug in front of the tree, his head propped on his hands as he admired the twinkling lights. James stood just beyond the threshold of the room, watching them both. For the first time in years, the house felt like it belonged to someone, not a fortress of solitude, but a home. "Merry Christmas," James said softly, stepping into the room. Tommy looked up immediately, his face lighting up with a grin. "Merry Christmas, Mr. James." James smiled faintly. "I have something for you, Tommy." Tommy shot upright, excitement bubbling over as James handed him a large, carefully wrapped gift. The boy tore through the wrapping paper, his little hands fumbling in his eagerness, until a thick leather-bound scrapbook appeared in his lap. Tommy blinked, puzzled at first, before slowly opening the cover. His mouth dropped open as he flipped through the pages. The book was filled with photographs. Pictures Sarah had told him stories about. Pictures of a man Tommy had never known but had always wondered about. His father. James's team had quietly gathered them overnight, carefully collecting images that painted a picture of the man who had loved Tommy before he was even born. Each photo was lovingly placed alongside handwritten notes, piecing together memories of laughter, adventures, and small moments that mattered most. Tommy's fingers traced a photograph of his dad sitting beside Sarah, her smile radiant. He whispered, "It's him." Sarah sat up, tears filling her eyes as she leaned closer to see. "James!" James rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "I thought maybe Tommy should have something to hold on to, something to help him remember where he comes from, even if it's just through stories." Tommy turned, throwing his arms around James in a sudden, fierce hug. "Thank you. It's the best Christmas ever." James froze for a moment, surprised by the strength of the boy's embrace. Slowly, he returned it, his throat tight. Tommy pulled back, grinning up at him. "I knew you could be a Christmas friend." James chuckled softly, ruffling Tommy's hair as Sarah wiped at her eyes, smiling through her tears. "I have something for you, too," James said, turning to her. He reached into his coat and handed her a small envelope. Sarah hesitated, her fingers brushing against it before carefully opening the flap. Inside was a handwritten letter on simple stationery. "Sarah, asterisk, I don't know how to make up for the time I lost or for the hurt I caused you, but I want you to know that I'm here now. For you, for Tommy, however you need me, whether as a friend or something more. I promise I won't disappear again. People say Christmas is about miracles, but maybe it's also about second chances. If you'll let me, I'd like to try. Asterisk. Merry Christmas. James." Sarah looked up, her eyes shimmering with emotion. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she smiled, a soft, forgiving smile that melted through years of distance and regret. "People really do change, don't they?" she said quietly. James nodded, his voice rough. "Some of us are lucky enough to get the chance." Sarah folded the letter carefully, holding it to her chest as she whispered, "Thank you." Tommy, oblivious to the deeper emotions shared between them, laughed brightly as he spread the scrapbook open across the rug. "Look, Mom, this one's my favorite." Sarah and James exchanged a look, one filled with understanding, with hope, and perhaps even the beginning of something new. They settled on the floor beside Tommy, the three of them tucked close as they admired the photographs, the fire crackling softly beside them. Outside the windows, snow fell gently, blanketing the world in quiet stillness. The warmth of the room seemed to chase away any lingering shadows of the past, leaving only the soft glow of love, forgiveness, and family. James sat back, watching Sarah laugh as she pointed out a story in one of the photos. Tommy beamed, his voice rising with excitement. For the first time in years, James felt something he'd forgotten how to name: peace. As the snow continued to fall outside, Tommy let out a contented sigh, leaning his head against James's arm. "This really is the best Christmas ever," he murmured sleepily. James smiled, glancing at Sarah, who met his gaze with the same warmth. "Yeah," James whispered, his voice soft. "It really is." And for the first time in a long, long while, he truly believed it. As the snow settles and the fire crackles, James, Sarah, and Tommy remind us that love, forgiveness, and second chances can heal even the deepest wounds. Sometimes the best gifts aren't the ones wrapped under the tree, but the ones we find in each other when we least expect it. If you enjoyed this heartwarming Christmas tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss more stories that warm the soul. Share this video with someone who needs a little holiday magic, and let us know in the comments, what's your favorite Christmas memory? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Merry Christmas!